Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm your host, Ann Snyder, and we've just begun a new season to bring some voice and verve to the essays of our summer issue, which explores something I'm calling the, quote, seedbeds of social change. We took a bit of a different stylistic tack on this one, opting for discrete narratives of those early moments of a big idea becoming mainstream, rather than sort of our usual series of arguments. When we look back at turning points in history, of shifts in public conscience and mores, of values and norms, we are just interested what is going on in the fragile ferment of a small group of people deciding that there may just be a better way to live and modeling themselves first how to do so. Today's conversation is going to shine a light on a movement, at least as historians would commonly label it, that is speckled throughout Comment's own audience as a magazine, although it doesn't wholly capture our editorial sensibility nor our theological roots, which I would argue kind of go further back. But that movement on the table today is evangelicalism, a movement which, as I see it, has played a vital role at various junctures in lending dynamism and spiritual empowerment to the laity, with a particular charism for sharing the message of the good news of Jesus Christ, and of course, honoring the scriptures as the most authoritative text. A movement which, at its worst, well, I think probably many of you listening are aware of what evangelicalism at its worst can do and look like, and may even be tired of that Jeremiah, at least in its American expression, though we will likely graze its underside today. I'm interested in the framing of evangelicalism as a movement, partly because my own life has been touched by it, thankfully mostly in healthy ways, and partly because it's a complicated kettle of fish, this particular ism, and it doesn't automatically bring to many people's minds, I don't think, an image of successful cultural transformation, as in a social movement as a movement is supposed to change something beyond itself, right? But has evangelicalism really been about more than the expansion of, well, itself? How do we understand a movement that is predicated on a discovery of truth in the ultimate but also personalist sense, and in some ways is more animated to draw people into that discovery than necessarily practically, coherently oriented towards changing the world from that discovery? Walter Kim is here with me today to help me and hopefully all of us understand this a little bit better. He has a deeply perceptive, forthright, and discerning soul, a bridge builder and a champion of the difficult room, and since January 2020, the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. Walter previously served as a pastor at Boston's historic Park Street Church and at churches in Vancouver, Canada, and Charlottesville, Virginia, as well as a campus chaplain at Yale University. He preaches, writes, and engages in collaborative leadership to connect the Bible to the intellectual and cultural issues of the day, and he also serves on the boards of Christianity Today and World Relief and consults with a wide range of organizations. Walter, it's an honor to know you a little bit and a real joy to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Anne. Delight to be here.
So, as stated, you now are stewarding the National Association of Evangelicals. Could you just share a bit of your own story as it has intersected with evangelicalism?
I really need to go far back, like right to the beginning. So I'm the son of refugee and immigrant parents who, in my father's case, had kind of fled from communism through the border of China, North Korea, then literally traveling in a barrel, crossing a river to get to South Korea. And there eventually met my mother. And at every juncture, there were people of faith who had welcomed them. My father had gone to the Catholic Medical College in Seoul, Korea. Both my parents had engaged with Christian faith groups that had been part of the reconstruction of South Korea after the devastation of the war. And a Lutheran pastor helped my parents immigrate. I recall living in the basement suite of an Irish Catholic family in the Bronx, New York, where I was born. And we had been involved in a Korean church in New York, as with many immigrant communities. The church had served a vital role. But we had moved from that to rural Pennsylvania. And so I spent much of my childhood in the foothills of Appalachia, and in a rather racially homogenous environment that gave me a window into different parts of America, both the urban as well as the rural, and some of the tensions that exist there. And it was during that time that a independent Baptist youth pastor had reached out and shared what was known at that point as the four spiritual laws with me one night after watching Star Wars, and asked me if Obi-Wan Kenobi's sacrifice to allow Luke and others to escape the Death Star, if that reminded me of anyone that we had been talking about. Of course, Jesus was the answer.
Oh my goodness. You are locating yourself right now.
So there in the parking lot, I prayed to receive Christ as my savior. And then there's been yes, exactly. And then there's this long, journey from that point on. And I share that because what I want to indicate is we talk about evangelicalism, and it's very easy to talk about it as a unitary phenomenon, when in fact it's evangelicalisms. There are regional differences, there are denominational flavors, seasonal changes of evangelicalism as it seeks to reinvent itself almost by the decade. This is not to say that there are tremendous problems that are creating something of an identity crisis at this moment, but my own life journey represents the work of evangelicalism throughout the world in humanitarian crisis to present a faithful presence of Jesus, however imperfect, yet compelling. And so when I became a Christian, I didn't call myself an evangelical. I became a Christian, a follower of Jesus. But I do owe much of my journey to these people of faith, these gospel people, and to a movement that has manifestations in all parts, all sectors of American life.
Yeah. Thank you for that sort of personal cartography. And I know you could probably go on for another 2 hours and more with all these like different layers and exposures, exemplars, influences on this sort of ongoing life journey. But it maps on very much slightly different origin in my own life, but it maps on, I think anyone, especially probably if you have a non-American background, whether living or in inheritance and family lineage, growing up overseas myself and having grandparents who were in Peru for a long time, growing up in Asia. It's fascinating how I too didn't really learn the word evangelical until I went to Wheaton College for undergrad, which was at the time, and I think I would still say this, being on that particular campus for all of its imperfections, like a very compelling icon institutionally of what this word meant. But I too was like, I'm just a Christian, and coming at it from this much more sort of global choir, almost cloud of witnesses who are modeling something very, very beautiful. And I think trying to understand the ism of it as some monolithic thing, insofar as the media characterizes it that way often, and I think some of our own political discourse the last 10 years, trying to discern, okay, what's useful about characterizing this as a monolithic thing? It's kind of like when pastors sometimes preach and they use the word, they start opining about the culture. And I confess, like in those moments, I'm like, and be humble, but what is the culture? Yes. There are many cultures. Like, what is but there's something you're getting. I mean, it's helpful to have, there's a spirit in the water, a zeitgeist, like that's a real thing to some degree. But this is where our language gets very imprecise and can ultimately be sort of damaging and super unhelpful. So Anyways, thank you for drawing out some of the intricacies of the personal coordinates. If you'll allow me, we can talk about evangelicalisms, but if you'll allow me to use poor shorthand and say evangelicalism a few more times in these questions, I'm curious how you would describe overall kind of the great genius. Is there a thread of a great genius in evangelicalism as a movement, as a flavor of faith?
Yeah. So, Anne, I think it is fair to say that there is a thread that goes through the different strands of evangelicalism so that we can talk about evangelicalism. And, historically, that's been understood in terms of doctrine, right? The David Bebbington's quadrilateral, thinking high view of Scripture, need to convert to Christ, the centrality of the atoning work of Jesus at the cross, and historically, a keen expression of activism that's not just in evangelization, kind of the proclamation of the gospel in the form of the four spiritual laws or a Billy Graham crusade, but it was also in its best and most robust moments expressive of the abolitionist movement, of addressing child labor, of caring for animals, and even stewarding creation. So all that is there. But I would also say beyond kind of the principles, the doctrinal positions, there's a certain kind of posture to evangelicalism. And I'm going to do a very evangelical thing. I'm going to alliterate here that there is populism, pietism, pragmatism, and personalism. And this is something of the genius, not beyond the kind of thread of theology that would connect us. There is a personality to evangelicals that whether you're of a Pentecostal sort or Presbyterian sort, whether you're in the Deep South or the Northwest of our country, and if you meet a global evangelicalism, there are certain kinds of postures that seem to come out. One is populism, that it's a people's movement. It's not something from the top down, but from the bottom up. Hence the great revivals. That it's pietistic, that it's deeply concerned with kind of the personal moral fabric of transformation. That this notion of personalism, that it's highly individualistic, and that's a bit accentuated in our American context, and it's ultimately very pragmatic of what is going to work. You think about the megachurch movement, you think about the Crusades, you think about even its social engagements. It's often taken the flavor of these 4 Ps. So we may have been, as evangelicals, engaged in great social movements, but it's less been about an engineer, holistic, theological understanding of public faith and more of a groundswell of people changed by Jesus on a personal level who just want to do good for their neighbor. This is its genius. It ends up being very entrepreneurial and able to self-invent. And I would say that even more than the theological thread of the quadrilateral, that I think is the genius, this kind of posture, personality of evangelicalism. It's also baked into that its greatest weakness. And maybe we'll unfold that a bit in our conversation.
You're re-inspiring me right now, which I'm grateful for. I was reminded of all the things you're describing, not in so eloquent, almost a listicle there of descriptives that map on very much to religious history. But when that sort of Asbury outpouring happened earlier this year, I think just watching that from afar, there was a fragrance of exactly what you're describing, even just pouring through the YouTube screen that you kind of, and it felt there was something timeless about it and old fashioned and pure of heart that was trustworthy, even if you can't put like a straight jacket of dogma around it, or, there was something, and I was like, this is, and people don't even want to use that word evangelical now because it's become a 4-letter word or overly politicized or racialized or whatever. But whatever is happening here is like something spurred on by God, and people are responding with humility and great. It's real. There is a movement of the Spirit that isn't totally explicable, but that changes lives and changes people and could eventually change the communities they serve. Thank you for drawing out some of those adjectives. On the weakness part, though, I'm curious how even all those strengths you just mentioned, which do have a dynamic character, which can't be contained necessarily in a box, which can kind of pervade as a fragrance. I used to say, like, do you have the real disease? Like, I can sort of see it in your eyes. And I would still just say, are you a Christian? Is the fruit of the Spirit in you? But I do think there's something, like, even I'm thinking about Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. I know I would call them evangelical Catholics or evangelical Orthodox in the way they describe a prayer life and describe a way in which they read the scriptures and sort of attend to tradition and situate themselves before it. There's something evangelical, again, in the personalism with which they are engaging with God ultimately, but also the gifts of the church. In the fluidity of that and the organic sort of nature of that and unpredictability of that, how does that square with a very fast-paced, complicated era where institutions are famously breaking down, trust is low, or we have a lot more autonomy, very pluralist society, at least this part of the world? Can that genius survive all these sort of societal dynamics?
I would have to say a qualified yes. And the yes part is,
okay,
insofar as evangelicalism is a renewal movement connected to the Spirit of God, responsive and reactive to God's Spirit, then of course God's Spirit is untamable in that way, unquenchable in that way. And in fact, insofar as evangelicalism is reflective of its, etymology of being from the evangelion, the good news of Jesus Christ, then insofar as it's connected to God's Spirit as a renewal movement, true and reflective of the gospel, the true evangelion of Jesus Christ, then it will flourish, because that's how it happened in the early church. You think about our globalism, the pluralism, economic transformation, ethnic tensions. These all existed in the time of the early church. The Roman Empire caused a mixing of people groups. So you look at Paul's epistles, and they're all trying to solve some kind of ethnic conflict. The Jewish Gentile. I mean, Paul didn't write Romans just so that Luther could rediscover it in 1500s, so that justification can be written about. He wrote it to solve an ethnic tension, a religious ethnic tension between Jews and Gentiles. Same could be said for Ephesians, dividing wall of hostility. So in that way, I suppose this is where I'm showing my evangelicalism. In that way, I have this unflagging confidence that we have been here before. Absolutely, God's people have been here before, responsive to God's Spirit. And in fact, the problems and challenges actually were the moments of the greatest flourishing in the early church, in the persecuted church throughout the globe right now, many of whom very distinctly identify as evangelicals. So yes, a resounding yes in that way, but a qualified yes in that it's also true that various movements of God have risen and have also faded. And that God's ultimate work, the church, the kingdom, his bride, the temple, that's going to flourish. But sociologically, any particular group, well, that might not remain. The church, the locus of the church and the dynamism of what I would call evangelical faith has moved from Europe and North America to the global south, to the Far East. So in that regard, evangelicalism, I'm very confident, because I'm confident in God and I'm confident in the gospel. But sociologically, people's groups, they do fade, and God's Spirit will find fresh wind to blow elsewhere. And in that regard, it's a qualified yes, because it remains to be seen, will evangelicalism in America go through its identity crisis, as our country is going through its identity crisis? And should we issue an obituary for its demise, or birth announcement for its renewal? And I think this decade is very critical. It's an inflection point to answer that question.
Pivotal.
I'm committed to seeing a birth announcement reissued and hopeful. Yeah, that's right.
Be our midwife, Walter. Come on. Do you think there is something about American evangelicalism, isms in particular, that is susceptible to Americanness?
Yeah, I do think American evangelicalism is susceptible to put the accent on the American and not the evangelical. And I think that's yes for two reasons. One is a general reason, because people always have this problem of conflating their faith with their identity, right? That was the issue, again, that much of the New Testament was trying to address, to detach Jesus from merely being a national savior to the global cosmic savior of all, not even of the nations, but the entire structures of the heavens and the earth and all the peoples, right? So there's always this tension that people have. And we see this all throughout church history as well. I mean, it wasn't just ancient Israel. It wasn't the early church. European Christianity, putting the accent on European. I would venture to say this is also happening in the Korean church, that as great revival has happened there, as it's become a powerful missionary sending country, as the nation has experienced blessing, there are times is this notion of Korean exceptionalism. They are now the true people of God, kind of God's favored nation status. I would say something unique about America. And so in that regard, American Christians are probably as susceptible as all people are. But with America, there is something else that I think is a convergence to the ethos and personality of evangelicalism. I talked about the entrepreneurial posture and personality of evangelicalism. When you have that as a religious movement, and couple it with the deep exceptionalism and entrepreneurial spirit of America, you have the double whammy that kind of personality is both the American personality and the evangelical personality. And it's doubly reinforced, this notion of exceptionalism. We have the true gospel. We're being faithful to recapturing what the gospel and the Spirit wishes to do. And we're like constantly reinventing, coming up with new ways of doing ministry. We're entrepreneurs. And so when you couple that, then yeah, I think there's a particular opportunity, but there's also a great danger to reinforce a certain type of personality that becomes less about Jesus and more about the personality, whether it's individual or cultural personality.
Yes. You're convicting me a little bit on my intro, even to this conversation, in that perhaps I'm erring in, and it may be a little bit, frankly, out of my own frustration. I'm really grateful that I have been tutored and formed by a series of, mostly I would say in the American context, I grew up overseas, but in the American context, becoming a Christian in high school in a very secular context. And then there's sort of a series of like the 20th century parachurch world that formed me and did like spiritual formation and showed me what it was to be a Christian. And that comes out of this like evangelical institution building that happened in the last century. But sometimes I think I have felt like I don't always recognize the character of my spiritual alma mater these days. And there is maybe too harsh a critique on my part, which somehow I think something about the grace with which you're both inhabiting your role and reflecting on this historically. Like I want to see if evangelicalism is sort of a movement of renewal, both renewal of people, but then when you when you experience like perfect love, in this case, divine love, it should change everything. And it doesn't change overnight. I mean, been much hand wringing about the lack of sort of formation and habit formation and youth groups and so on. And we don't need to talk about that. But I think in the last, say, 30 years, or even dating back to the 60s, and is, again, in the American context, the civil rights movement, wondering like, why weren't there evangelicals marching with King? And where is sort of the public witness? Why does a sense of like public Christian witness and even some real politique come more out of the mainline or the Catholic world? What is that about? And I don't think that was as true in the 19th century in American evangelicalism. Like there was a sense of social change and, social gospel kind of came from a different stream. But there's a long way of saying sometimes my own frustration, rightly or wrongly, is that evangelicalism today takes on more of the character of kind of an inward subculture rather than yeast that is itself transformed and transformative for a broader leavening of our society. And I say that at the same time, I also feel like some of my greatest agents of hope for our democracy, for our social fabric, for a peaceful society come from quiet evangelical Christians who work in police departments and are doing really interesting reform, or in healthcare centers, or certain kinds of social entrepreneurs, but they don't tend to be loud, or they don't have a national bully pulpit. So you don't always know them. I come across them because I come from that journalistic background. So it's like I'm saying two things out of both sides of my mouth, which is at some large level, I yearn to see, like I wanted to see after that Asbury outpouring, if this is real, like now what does this mean for our institutions to kind of make some progress and be more unified in how we, for instance, talk about race or certain issues around justice or whatever. And I want to see that like coherent and large at a national level, not in a way that is ego driven, but that is somehow drawing others and intriguing others who don't even understand the priors. And yet at local levels, I do see very much a serve society, serve the public good. But so anyways, I'm just wondering, like, do you agree? Because it sounds like I think you disagree with me that it's not fair for me to say evangelicalism is just basically like a cul-de-sac. It doesn't actually change anything anymore. It seems like it has its own radio stations, it has its own bookstores, it has its own pat answers and formulas, and it's for its own social club, which I'm just not really interested in. Do you agree with that? Or am I being too harsh and myopic?
What you've described is such a compelling and at times really heartbreaking diagnosis of this movement. And I would have to say, absolutely, voices like yours, critique like yours are necessary and actually should be welcomed, because if evangelicals take seriously the scriptures, which, that's like one of the pillars, the authority of scriptures, it's replete with a kind of self-critique of its heroes that you do not find really in much of ancient literature, especially in the ways that scripture describes it, right? With the exceptions of very handful of characters, most of the characters in the Bible are incredibly flawed and openly described that way. And so we should, as evangelicals, be very open to the declaration of, woe is me. I'm a sinful person living among sinful people. Who's going to save me from this? How is this going to turn out? So that kind of critique is really important and fair. There is a critique to be had. I think there's how do we square together the beautiful moments of evangelicalism that coming out of these great revivals, evangelicals really were, many of them, at the forefront of justice issues, as I've mentioned before. So many of the great movements in America really were functions of revivals that had led to social transformation with an institution building. And here's I think, my take on the situation of what's going awry. And that is, while it's very strong, again, in its personality on the personal and the pragmatic, it is not strong in the public and the systemic. So in other words, the gospel leads to personal transformation. I am personally transformed by Jesus. So I want to love my neighbor. I want to do good. And you band together with others to apply the gospel for social good because Jesus changed your life. That is different than saying the gospel actually has a social implication. To say that the gospel has a social application makes it discretionary, makes it something that, okay, Jesus changed my life, and then, I should probably apply it. But there's no kind of institutionally systemic public theology in which when the revivals fade, and they do, when you personally don't feel close to Jesus, and you will, is there something in the very structure of your faith that says, not just apply it when you feel like it, but it is part and parcel to the very structure of the gospel to say that it's not just for personal salvation, it is for public transformation. And evangelicalism, I would say, is historically weak. And what we see is the ebbs and flows of the personal application by groups of people who rise up to create these movements. But when the movement fades, the dynamism of the movement fades, then there's nothing to kind of institutionally sustain it in its public theology, public implications of the gospel that's deeply baked in to how evangelicals understand their faith. So they can no more let go of Jesus changes my life personally and publicly as two sides of the same coin, because it's baked into their understanding of the good news of Jesus. When it's not, then it becomes discretionary to apply the gospel in these social ways. I think that's one of the deep fractures that exist right now. It's why we, as evangelicals, no matter what flavor you are, Pentecostal, Presbyterian, and what organization, NAE, nearly 40 different denominations from all these different, flavors of Christianity, and scores of institutions, from the humanitarian Christian institutions to educational institutions, childcare facilities, and all this. It's very easy to get us as evangelicals to sign statements of faith. It's very difficult to get us to agree on a posture toward culture, because one is baked into our understanding of faith, certain theological affirmations. The other hasn't yet to be baked in. And in Catholic social teaching and other traditions, it is more baked into the actual understanding of theology. And this is where I hope evangelicals can and must, and I see spaces in which it is growing. And my hope is this next decade that we quit oscillating from one extreme to the next, because we have something deep and abiding and robust in understanding the public dimensions of our faith as essential and as inherent, intrinsic to faith as the personal transformation is.
Walter Kim, I need to drop my mic right there. Also, frankly, you just gave Comment Magazine like a new reason for existing as a what are we, public theology for the common good? So maybe we can help play a little role, like a brick to that bridge. That was powerfully stated, and now we need to get down to tactics and strategy. But I'll just, to take off your sort of final intonation there, do you have a dream for evangelicalism or the shape of evangelicalism? If you could see this movement purified and revitalized in a way that befits Jesus's prayer in John 17, what's a picture you can give our listeners of your hope for evangelicalism that you would love to see in the next 10 or even 100 years?
Thank you. I'm going to do an evangelical thing and, have a closing illustration.
Okay, benediction, please.
That's right. As well as a closing comment about a passage of scripture. Even evangelicalism right now is transforming. I mean, it's deeply, the immigrant churches have infused all sorts of interesting life into evangelicalism. So it is actually changing. The composition is changing, right? And that kind of influx is making us more aware of the global work of God. So in 2019, just before I started my position, but knew that I would be entering into it in 2020, I attended the World Evangelical Alliance Global Assembly in Jakarta, Indonesia. And there were 800 delegates from 90 different countries, and I was part of the American delegation. There was a plenary session in which panelists from parts of the world were present to talk about what's going on with American evangelicalism. There are panelists from the Latin American world, Africa, Asia, Europe, no American on it. There was a candid discussion. I expected for it to be just a fusillade of critiques of what's wrong with American evangelicalism. There were critiques, but for the most part, it was an actual plea. We need you as partners in the global work of God. You have a vital role to play. And we are praying that God works out whatever you are going through in your identity crisis right now, because we need you for this global work. And I had so much to ponder as I got back on the bus to get back to the hotel from the conference center. I mean, there's a heaviness in my heart. And so I decided I need to get to the back of the bus because I needed to find where the fun evangelicals are, right? And they're always at the back of the bus, right? So I went to the back of the bus and there they were. There was a group of people and they were laughing. And I thought, okay, what country are they from? Because that's like a fun evangelical group. And when I introduced myself to them and they to me, I discovered that they were delegates who had just recently met each other at this conference. They were Palestinian and Israeli followers of Jesus. Who in their laughter were also sharing prayer requests and plans to collaborate. And when I think about some of the most intractable problems in this world, I think we'd have to put that problem, that challenge, political, social, religious, way up there. And here in the back of the bus is a picture of God's global work of people transformed by Jesus, who are seeking transformation in some of the most perplexing problems in this world. And it reminds me of this vision in Ezekiel chapter 47, the exile, where it looked like the work of God was completely squashed in this world. And in the midst of exile, God gives Ezekiel this vision of a little trickle of water emanating from the temple of God, this kind of eschatological temple of God, which is the people of God, ultimately. Jesus said, destroy this temple, I will raise it up in 3 days. He meant his body. And then he turned over that work to his body, the church, which is the temple of God. So emanating from this eschatological temple in Ezekiel 47 is this little trickle of water. Then it's ankle deep, knee deep, waist deep. Then it's so great that it can't be traversed. And on the banks of that river were trees whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. And it dumps into the Dead Sea. And when then there was deadness, there is life and vibrancy. To me, this is what I dream. This is what I pray for. This is what I see happening throughout the world. What appears to be a trickle, and frankly, sometimes it really does feel like just a trickle, can become something so grand and glorious that it produces leaves for the healing of the nations. This is what I pray that evangelicalism contributes to the life of America at a time when it's profoundly needed, that we would be the people infused by the living water of Jesus, producing the fruit of the Spirit and having leaves for the healing of our nation.
From your lips to God's ears and our hearts, Walter Kim. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. This has been so encouraging.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Public theology for the common good, so vital for our moment.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. Our overarching mission is to foster an imagination for a thriving society. We publish pieces by cultural luminaries and pioneering practitioners. We equip and convene leaders through forums, dinners, and symposia. We produce this podcast and a still feistier one about the evolving relationship between religion and democracy called Zealots at the Gate. And we are stewarding a budding institutional ecosystem animated by the Christian humanist tradition known as Breaking Ground. Comment readers are society's weavers, those community shepherds laboring to hold our social fabric together. And our job in all that we do is to help them, help you, rehumanize the age, equipping you with frameworks, stories, and exemplars to sustain your vocational joy, refresh your vision, and connect you with one another to effect real cultural change. Consider joining us. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood, or attend one of our webinars with an author and your fellow readers. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comment.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.